First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Although it's still morning here in Brazil, it's such an honor to be part of this conference. And secondly, this paper will be presented from Brazil by me and my friends, Daniela Rosendo and Tânia Kuhnen. So the main purpose of our talk today, entitled Coloniality and Speciesism, Reflection from the South, is to analyze the contribution of decoloniality studies to animal thinking and activism. For this, we want to briefly present the historical aspects of the concept of coloniality from the philosopher Maria Lugones. Then we will introduce speciesism as a component of critical analysis concerning the effects of coloniality, not only on political human minorities, but also on non-human beings. Through an ecofeminist lens, we can identify that their and our subjugation to exploitation systems are intensified by the demands of global developmental capitalism, which, among others, promotes standardization of food through multinational industries. And finally, we conclude with some considerations about how veganism should be understood under the colonial anti-speciesist ecofeminism. So during the 70s and 80s, great efforts were made by intellectuals and artists in Latin America to offer critical analysis tools that for that period marked by the military coups that implanted dictatorships in our region. There was an attempt to understand the political influences and external economic interests located in this anti-democratic process that was advancing in the Latin America context. The result was the attempt to naturalize the phenomena of poverty and hunger, as well as to make fragile the autonomy of peoples, especially ethnic groups. The Modernity Coloniality Working Group is part of a critical movement that from the beginning aimed to question the basis of a colonial project. This group made the fundamental distinction between colonialism and coloniality, both concepts presented as part of so-called colonial project. To make this distinction, the Puerto Rican philosopher Nelson Maldonado Torres states that colonialism precedes coloniality, and that the later survives colonialism since its tentacles are beyond the outcome of traditional colonialism. Based on this, the thinker Aníbal Quijano proposed the concept of coloniality of power. According to Quijano, it's a conceptual device that helps us to name and understand the structure of domination that subjected Latin America, Africa, and Asia, based on the discourse of the action of conquest. The term alludes to the invasion of the other's imaginary, that is, their westernization. More specifically, it concerns a discourse that is inserted in the road of the colonized, but it's also reproduced in the locus of the colonizer. In a critical dialogue with Quijano's, the Argentine feminist philosopher Maria Lugones proposed the notion of coloniality of gender, which seeks to explain how the colonial dichotomous and hierarchical logic cannot be thought dissociated from the essentialist aspect of the sex dualism. The author thinks of coloniality based on the subjectivation process of the colonized and reconfigured subjects based on opposite and vertical forms, such as the male versus female opposition pair, but also the compulsory heterosexuality present in the colonial project and thinking. Along with racialization and capitalist exploitation, there is still a process of dehumanization that makes the colonized being inferior to those named human beings or colonial subject under the rubric of the heterosexual white man from global north. In this sense, As Lugones points out, it would be necessary to theorize about these intersections at the risk of ignoring inseparable aspects for many subjects oppressed by the colonial regime, whose project of power, knowledge, and being compulsorily brought with them the marks of race, class, gender, and sexuality as features of exclusion. And following on her critical approach to gender category, in this article, Towards a Decolonial Feminism, Lugones states that the oppression of women occurs through a combined process of racialization, colonization, capitalist exploitation, and heterosexualism. We understand that the colonial contribution offers an interesting diagnosis for a critical thinking that situates the isms of oppressions in the global South, that has supported the structural inequalities based on dichotomies established by colonial thoughts. In this way, we propose an ecofeminist perspective that focused on a critical analysis of the oppositions that includes human versus non-human animals, and we call this a decolonial anti-speciesist ecofeminism. We think this perspective is relevant and fundamental to understand the broad scenario in which the Global South has been situated in the organization of the geopolitical economy and how political minorities, human and non-human animals, has been oppressed by it.
Following Fabio's thought, we are trying to argue that colonialism is a form of a geopolitical strategy of domination that occurred in the past, indeed. However, coloniality was not restricted to usurp territories, but it has also decimated whole cultures and their worldviews, including how they establish relations with nature and other than human animals. In a chapter from the book Ecofeminisms, Theoretical Foundations and Intersectional Praxis, the Brazilian philosophers Maria Clara Dias, Suane Soares, and Letícia Gonçalves demonstrated, 1, how close ecofeminism and decolonial feminism are. Both fields share the critique of the alleged universal subject, who is actually situated in a patriarchal, cis, and hetero-centered, racist, classist, urban logic. And second, how different and highly complex systems of oppression, domination, and exploitation are related, which restricts a broadened concept of justice. And 3, how hegemonic and homogeneous concepts of justice excludes the singularity of the moral subjects and fail to achieve justice. This is precisely why an ecofeminist aroused from the Global South brings contextual issues of colonialism and must comprehend the importance of epistemicide derived from the colonialist project. That is why it's so important to highlight the ecological cosmologies of the indigenous peoples and cultures in the present Global South that were targeted by colonization and imperialism. Mercantilism, capitalism, and nowadays neoliberalism saw in this nature and tropical weather a source of mere inputs, animals, plants, and seeds. As stated by Dias, Soares, and Gonçalves, and I quote them, ecofeminism and decolonial feminism are, although originated in different parts of the globe, associable through a perception that colonialism does not work without the exploitation of nature, and the exploration of nature does not work without the colonization of the peoples that inhabit certain regions. What regions are these? Precisely the tropical regions. The so-called countries of the South make up the massive population exploited in the tropical and subtropical regions. I finished quoting them. Similarly, Vandana Shiva, the renowned Indian physicist and feminist activist, developed the concept of monocultures of the mind in order to point out the intellectual face of colonialism throughout local traditions and stifled by globalized colonial thought and consequently assumed as partial, backward, and inferior. On the other hand, practices from colonizers are presented as universal, developed, and a symbol of progress. Due to this alleged universality, local knowledge from the colonized is intentionally vanished. According to Shiva, monocultures begin in the mind and then are transferred to the soil. The monocultures of the mind are responsible for a model of production that destroys diversity and legitimates the expression as if it were progress, growth, and improvement. So, the monoculture of the mind is a metaphor through which diversity is eradicated as unwanted weed. Just like dictatorships exterminate dissident voices from the ones who are gone, political missing persons. Intellectual colonialism eliminates subordinated knowledge in order to make it also disappear. Born of a dominating and colonizing cultures, modern knowledge systems are themselves colonizers. Like ecofeminists defend that environmentalism and animal liberation must include a gender perspective, since the oppression of women, animals, and nature are interconnected, we understand that ecofeminist theories and practices must include not only an anti-speciesist perspective, but also a decolonial one. Consequently, the colonial feminism should engage in anti-speciesist ecofeminism as well.
So, considering the decolonial anti-speciesist ecofeminism shift presented by Fabio and Daniela, anti-speciesism should include a range of intersectional issues related to the global south. Particular reference, especially in Brazil, can be made to the struggles for land and for the right to access to adequate food against nutricide. In both cases, women are at the front building resistance strategies against production and consumption standardization impositions that integrate the domination system from the global north upon the global south. These strategies may include agroecology, organic family farming, extractivism in small scale allied with forest preservation, cultivation and preservation of local and not genetically modified seeds, cultivation and consumption of plants and vegetables considered with no commercial value, use of all sorts of veggies to cook. Resistance strategies such as these mentioned provide narratives that help us to rethink the interrelationships between life forms in a non-dualistic and hierarchical way. They help us to confront predetermined social scripts and to see that the globalizing food industry is part of the coloniality associated with capitalism, and it is not the solution to be imagined for the global south. Veganism in a decolonial way should be promoted as an outcome of the fracturate locus, a resistance to different forms of domination, including nutricide. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to end all forms of oppression. As a decolonial ecofeminist praxis, veganism involves fighting against its reduction to the idea of plant-based allied to strategies of taste colonization. When multinational food corporations linked to transgenic food, animal and human exploitation, agribusiness and deforestation come into the scene, we have the consequence of a standard supply of food to cover vegan options in hypermarket chains. Vegan options can just be about the promotion of a depoliticized vegan food standardization that is uncompromised with intra and interspecies justice. In this way, the food imagination is also colonized and globally appropriate. This directly affects other ways of growing food, as well as the food variety itself planted, cared for according to the cycles of nature in different regions and by subalternized groups like indigenous, quilombolas, ribeirinhos, geraizeiros populations, and many other ethnicities that inhabit the colonial difference in Brazil. In this context, Fabio Oliveira stresses the importance of the right to the territory of indigenous people and traditional communities across the global south as a form of resistance to the advance of overexploitation sustained by the animal industrial complex. As pointed out by Oliveira, we now have at least two fields of dispute that flirt with what we call the coloniality of the species, which sees animals as a specific type of capital. On the one hand, the openly speciesist perspective that rejects veganism and any manifestation of anti-speciesist struggle. On the other hand, the adoption of depoliticized veganism, whose purpose is to translate veganism as a market niche or a lifestyle. Beyond this restrictive way of comprehending veganism, which suggests that decolonial anti-speciesist ecofeminism should untie the knots of the colonial system instead of contributing to the intensification of the oppression of political minorities in the global south, engulfed by precarious work forms in the development model of global capitalism. It can include the support of regional activities conducted by women or local people organized in cooperatives, whose food and meal preparations include all types of veggies. Sometimes, some of these ingredients are even not seen as food. Consequently, they do not fit into the marketing systems. However, they can be considered part of the concept of adequate food because of their nutrient richness that contributes to food and nutritional security. In these counter-hegemonic narratives, sometimes real foods based exclusively on plants are even not called vegan. Through this linguistic strategy, it is possible to move away from dualism built around what is vegan and non-vegan. The main concern is the preparation of healthy and nutritious food on the use of wholly vegetables produced without pesticides and chemical additives. The non-use of specific words already crystallized in some contexts can avoid hierarchies and division of people into opposite groups, for example, vegetarians versus vegans. Additionally, it can provide us with instruments to rethink our situated body in its relations with food preparation, as well as stimulating us to reconfigure practice and knowledge related to the production, preparation, and consumption of food. It can make us more aware of the pathways of food until it reaches our bodies. Thus, we can denaturalize our artificial relationship with the food offered within the paradigm of coloniality, which presents us normally with food packaged on supermarket shelves or displayed in restaurants, buffets, and menus. To summarize, we understand that decolonial anti-speciesist ecofeminism offers tools that diagnose and recognize ways to overcome interconnected oppression, valuing other knowledges, epistemologies, and cosmovision. It allows us to confront violence that specifically falls on women and non-human political minorities in the global south, where speciesist geopolitics occurs associated with other isms of domination. So we will finish here, and thank you very much.